There would be pressures, I think. I can see it in the NDP and I can see it in the Liberals, where there are going to be parts of those two parties that will push for budgets for other things and not necessarily for science. So, I think until they're asked directly that question and they make the commitment, you can't take it for granted, if you will.
The point taken, yeah. And so among the people who can ask that question directly are constituents of NDP and Liberal MPs, which you all probably are. So, but in any case, it's reversible. I mean, you can't restore funding. It's a fairly straightforward process. Certainly, I know, and Katie may personally disagree with me on that, but one of the big things you can't reverse is, some very, very good people have been lost. Whether something like whether it's just to use one of the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Science, would any government come back in and completely restore a thing that essentially no longer exists except as a bureaucratic memory? Maybe not. And it was doing some very important stuff. So you might, there might, even if the funding was restored in another way, you might lose some critical people, some critical data. So there are, I think, permanent damages. I think our international reputation is something that's going to take a long time. That sense of trust in Canada as a fair actor in things like climate talks is going to be a long time in restoring that sort of faith. So certainly there's not and you might disagree, but I don't see anything where you look at it that there's no reversing that. We've lost something forever. Not a lot anyway, but there's lots of things that are going to take a lot of work to bring back.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me that is what's so scary about what's happened, is that even when there's a lot of outcry over things, it's very rare. I mean, I think it's almost unprecedented that a new government goes back and changes the things the old government did. I mean, traditionally the new government sort of start with what's there as the new basis. I would be very surprised if a lot of what has happened is actually undone. And I think there's a lot of examples where the changes are permanent. For a lot of things where we have, long continuous data sets, even at the ELA, it is sort of saved, although they have to have a final deal by the end of this month, and it hasn't been announced yet, but hoping that it is saved by the end of this month. There are still experiments there that had been done, every year continuously that weren't done. So there's no, in these long-term data sets, there's no going back and filling in that data. It's missing. Same thing with the long-form census. Sure, you can reinstate it, but you're still, missing periods in that, time series that you're just never going to get back. And that's the point I tried to make too with the major support from NSERC, is that so many of these facilities, especially the ones up north, if they're not upkept, they're going to degrade over time and essentially be useless, and it's going to cost so much more to sort of get them working again than if you had just done the maintenance every year. So I think we have lost a lot that isn't going to come back.
And I think the two of you might know more than me what's the latest on this, but the ice core samples that Natural Resources Canada had, were you aware of that story that they, at some point, Natural Resources Canada had this a collection of ice core samples in refrigeration, and then they decided, well, we can't afford this anymore, so we're just going to get rid of it. So they were looking for another operator in the academic world. They found it, they did, but I guess that'll be a story I'll have to pursue.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
you didn't.
I remember seeing that part of the story, but not the resolution. So.
Yeah.
And the one thing I would add as somebody with a background in politics is get concrete commitments from the opposition parties. Because they're going to say a lot of nice things about all the stuff that's going to reverse, and they're going to get into power and forget all about it. So if you actually want to see things reversed, the way to do that is to make sure that you get clear, concrete commitments from the opposition parties on the record. We're going to go right up at the top in the red plaid shirt.
Thank you. I wanted to know if there was any rays of hope at the provincial level of governments across Canada, or if it's more of the same. Or is there a huge disparity between provincial governments and how they're supporting scientific research, and how provincial level government scientists are available to the public?
So the question was whether there were any rays of hope at the provincial level in Canada, and if the situation was similar with provincial governments to what's happening at the federal level, or if scientists were more available at the provincial level.
It's that's a really great question. It seems to vary a lot. I mean, Ontario and Manitoba stepped in to fund the ELA, so that's at least a little bit of good news. I've heard some pretty bad things about British Columbia in terms of government interfering with science and sort of changing reports and things like that. And they've been cutting some really good sort of evidence-based institutions as well. I've heard not so great things about Alberta. But yeah, it's sort of, I only hear anecdotes from people. We haven't really looked at it in depth.
I mean, certainly my sense is the provincial governments, whatever they're doing on the ground, are less centralized in their message disciplining, in any case, for the most part. I mean, there may be exceptions, but I mean, you know, Alberta, where I live, you know, as a journalist, you can generally, you know, get interviews if you wanted to talk to government researchers. There might be things that the government is doing, and the provincial government in Alberta, for example, has done kind of, you know, suppressive kind of stuff around oil sands reports and toxicology reports on the Athabasca River, that sort of thing. David Schindler could talk your ear off about that. But that said, you can get somebody on the phone if you need to get them on the phone. So the way the federal government is going about this seems to be pretty singular. Although maybe the BC government has learned a few lessons from it. I'm not sure.
Okay, up here.
Hi, my name is Robert Ramsey. I work with the Association of University Teachers. And we've actually been running a series of town halls across the country that bring academic researchers into forums like this to talk about these issues. And it's been really successful in combating some of that chill. So that's my preliminary comment.
That's perilously close to the line. Allow it.
My question is very short, less than 10 seconds. We've been talking about a concierge service. Today I was writing a memo and used the term vending machine. Now because of this new business innovation access program where the NRC is apparently giving $50,000 vouchers to businesses to cash in for university research. Do any of you know any more about that? Because I don't know actually very much about it.
So the question is about $50,000 vouchers being given out, which can be cashed in for research services, and whether the panel knows anything about that.
I don't. This is the first I've heard of it, but it is consistent with a pattern that I had described to me of the direction the NRC is going in. I guess that would be what I would say, is that the sense I got from the folks I talked to there, and some have talked to me since the book has come out, is that the further up the kind of hierarchy you get, the less the people there seem to even understand what research and science are for. Eventually ending, of course, with guys like Gary Goodyear is no longer the Minister of State for Science and Technology, but he was the one who said the whole concierge service, you know, sort of articulated that vision. And you know, his background in science is as a chiropractor. He has no advanced degree or anything like that. So, I mean, that sounds like the kind of thing that they would think would be a good idea. The one thing I'll mention, just because I didn't go into depth in this when I was talking earlier, is that if you look at the kind of greatest hits of the NRC, and there's lots of them, the one I described in the book is things like, you know, some of the foundational work that led to Canada's computer graphics industry was done at the NRC, and it was not done in response to an immediate business problem. That's not how long-term R&D innovation happens. So even on that thing that they think that they've made a priority, which is, you know, helping business to innovate, they don't really seem to understand how it works. It's a long, slow process of trial and error, like all science is. Yeah, so thanks for pointing that out. Though.
Yeah, well, keep your eyes open for it. I think it was just announced today.
Right.
Yeah, I just want to say, I got into trouble a couple of weeks ago because I had written in a story that the NRC was a concierge service. So the media relations in the minister's office immediately got back to me and said, we're not a concierge service, even though this part is on our website, but it's only a but yeah, it's a small part, they said, of what the NRC does, and the NRC still does a lot of other things, and the concierge service is one of those things. They were also pointing out in the conversation with the comms people, they were kind of upset with Gary Goodyear, and they felt that, you know, he had used these words and terms that kind of branded the NRC as a concierge service, and that wasn't what they wanted, so he might have communicated the wrong way, or maybe that was the vision at the time, and then they realized that people didn't really think that was a great idea. So Yeah, and also to be fair, that term comes from a report that was done analyzing the future of the NRC, and it used that word concierge service, which the government was happy to adopt, so.
Great, so we're running close to the end, so we're going to be able to take, I think, probably 2 more questions. I see one over here and one over there, so we'll start right here.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Shannon, and I do science studies. I teach it, I studied it. I have a question about how journalists in Canada report on climate change. Is it different from the way reporting is done in the US? Because I think the case has been made that the equal time rule in the US means that, reporting on climate change is obfuscated by the fact that you report what a climate scientist does, giving her equal time, and then you give a born-again Christian equal time reporting on climate change. So is it different in Canada?
So the question, again for the live stream, is whether there's a difference in how science is reported on in the United States and in Canada, and that in the United States the equal time rule means that you'll have a climate scientist on and then give equal time to a fundamentalist Christian who will deny climate change. So the question was about whether, what are the differences in reporting on climate change between Canada and the US?
Right. Well, so to begin with, those, insofar as there are rules, they are only around political campaigns. There is no equal time rule. You're not obliged as a journalist to let a flat earther or someone who's bought and paid for by the Koch brothers have that say. They just got in the habit of doing it because it was a way to avoid what they considered to be a controversial topic, and because it made be colorful and lively, and we like controversy and the rest of it. Canadian media tends to be a little bit better on that score than some of the mainstream American outlets. But it is actually a problem that seems to be endemic to the topic at this point. In part, and this brings it back to our topic tonight, because climate scientists, a lot of them were reluctant to, because it was such a complicated thing, and you didn't want to be out there saying unequivocally this is what's happening when it's this, one of the most complicated scientific topics in the public arena, and anything you say is going to be amplified. So scientists didn't want to the scientists who were doing the actual climate science, so a bunch of shills, some of whom literally did the exact same thing for the tobacco industry, became this counterbalance to the point where the public perception, and it is stronger in the U.S., that there is an ongoing active debate is so far out of all proportion to what's actually happening in that discussion that it's one of the great kind of media crimes. With basically mainstream journalists got played on climate change. There was very, very careful, deliberate, well-funded strategy to seed doubt where none existed, and but that's not because anyone had to. That was because they got played. Is sort of how I would say it. That said, it does seem to be, and I wonder, some of this is almost structural with journalism. If the story is that climate change is happening and it's serious and it's huge, that story is only a story once in a lot of conventional journalist minds. So if something pops up that says, actually, there's this pause in global warming, all the attention goes to that, and that's now amplified out of proportion, and they don't follow up on it properly. The other thing I would say, and I know you're going to add to this, one of the huge problems in Canada and beyond is how few journalists have this as their beat. That's part of the reason why Mike and his colleague Margaret were doing such great work, and why it was so vital, and still is so vital, because there's so little of it. I mean, I don't think the Globe even has a dedicated science reporter anymore, does it? Or
Yeah,
do they? Okay. Yeah. But I mean, certainly nobody who, to my mind, climate change should be a beat the same way, politics is a beat, and you do see that in some of the British papers, for example, but not here in Canada.
We're starting to see some more specialty publications coming out that are focusing exclusively on this issue, which, it is a shift in the media as well, as I think as the media model changes a bit in Canada. But I mean, to answer your question, from my standpoint, if I was writing something on climate change, my threshold or my rule is I'm asking if I'm talking to someone who's published peer-reviewed papers and if they know what they're talking about, if they're an expert, if I'm talking about the science. So when we covered the first volume of the IPCC report that came out in September, we were quoting from the IPCC report, which had very careful and measured language about what the consensus was amongst all the countries and the scientists from those countries gathered around the table. So that is, that is how we draw the piece. I didn't call up the Heartland Institute or the Fraser Institute for comment on what the IPCC was saying, and it wasn't necessary or it wasn't required, and that's not the role of a journalist to call a dentist to ask about a heart problem. So, I think that is a rule that most journalists follow now in Canada. I don't follow as much in the U.S. To know exactly how, but I mean, I've seen a lot of coverage in the U.S. that is very similar to the New York Times or the Washington Post, the LA Times, and yeah, that's how I put it. And then maybe it has changed in 30 years ago, it might have been different.
Okay, last question, very concise.
Okay, following up on something you discussed before, I read an article in the New Yorker recently, it was kind of about the terrifying implications of corporate funded science. There was another guy at University of California, they're really short, took money from an agribusiness company to study the impact of their herbicide, discovered it was causing hermaphroditism in tadpole populations, and then got blackballed for a decade. So I'm curious, in Canada, if the government is cutting funding, is there a concurrent increase in corporate funded science? What the gentleman possibly mentioned, the $50,000 vouchers, is this happening? And if so, what are the implications for the availability and publication of evidence-based science, and what are the implications for potential corporatization of university science?
So the question is, if in Canada with cuts to government funding for science, there's an increase in corporate funding for science, and the implications of that for the corporatization and the access to the results of important science.
Well, that's a great question. So that person is Tyrone Hayes, and I actually was fortunate enough to see him at a conference when I was doing my PhD work, and he was absolutely inspirational for me as a scientist who, he's been someone who does excellent science and has not been afraid to communicate it, even though, at times it has been really, personally challenging for him. So I think he's a great role model for scientists. I think what's interesting in Canada is, we don't even need the industry to fund industry science, because the government is funding industry science for them, which is, what is a little odd in my mind. And absolutely it's come at the expense of, government science. And the way I always think of this is, corporate funded science is not going to be the science that shows you that secondhand smoke is harmful. That has to be government science. That's the science that's going to sort of keep that in check, and that's what we're losing. I don't know about the trends of industry-funded science in Canada. I certainly know that is leading to, like I mentioned, where academic scientists are sort of muzzled. It's usually because of large corporate funding and confidentiality agreements associated with that, but I don't know what the funding trends are.
Yeah, well, it might be too early to tell, but certainly things like NSERC preferring you to have an industry partner or some sort of obvious business, public-private partnership kind of thing. Government loves public-private partnerships because it gets the sort of grandstand on having done the thing while not having to pay for a lot of it. But that's the worry, is that, some of the most important science that government does is not only an obvious partnership for business, but is antithetical to some of the goals of some of those businesses, and that would be the concern, is that maybe not in any specific sort of, maybe not as egregious example as you're describing, where it's the company actually funding the research and then bearing it, but even just that over time the bias is so far away from solid research that more and more we're just getting this stuff that business wants to see and not seeing the other stuff funded. That would be my biggest concern. That said, I think we do see certainly businesses endowing chairs and things like that a lot more. Whether that means that the scientist or the researcher in question is forever biased by that, I don't know. There's so not a scientist, but a business professor at the University of Alberta named Andrew Leach, who is the endowed Enbridge chair of I can't remember, energy and something or other. And yet Andrew's like a fantastic, objective, careful researcher who, writes for now Maclean's and that sort of thing. So, he doesn't seem to be constrained by the fact that his chair has Enbridge's logo in it. So, maybe too soon to tell what that's going to mean.
Okay, great. Well, that comes to the end of our panel tonight. Before you all clap, I want to really thank Vicky and her co-organizer, who shall remain nameless, for their tireless work in putting this on. All of the volunteers who did so much work to make sure it was live streamed, all the media partners, everybody that helped bring this amazing event together. Also, of course, the Biology Graduate Students Association, the Departments of Biology, Geography and Physics, and the Faculty of Science here at McGill. The Redpath Museum, last but not least, our 3 amazing panelists. The book is available in both languages out front, and our author will be available to sign your copy. So please make sure to stop and pick up a copy on your way out. There are probably still some refreshments, and you can chat their ears off. Now you can clap.
Also,